when we ended the talk about the New Deal, I told you that the New Deal isn't what ends the Great Depression. All of these programs help and they provide temporary assistance. And I told you that those long term programs are designed to be long term. But in order for any of those to make any kind of real difference, in order for the economy to come back and actually grow and actually make a turn for the real positive, the economy needed a jumpstart. It needed something to really jolt it back into action. And bizarrely enough, it would take a war, and that's World War II. So, in regards to American efforts, most people tend to focus on 1941 to 1945. But the truth is that American involvement began when the war began in 1939. And so we're going to talk about how it all sort of unfolds. I want to give you some background here as to how everything comes together. So I'm just going to do a very quick outline or a timeline so that way you see what leads to what and how quickly it all happens. That's really what's important here. So remember, I told you that in March of 1933, Roosevelt becomes president of the United States. He is inaugurated, and at that same time, Hitler becomes the German chancellor. So these two men, at this consequential moment in human history, become leaders of their country, and they both have this campaign, these ideas of how to restore their national economies and their national greatness. Both of them argue that systems have to be changed, but both of them have very different ways on how to do that. So let's focus on what's going on in Europe. 5 years after Hitler takes control in Germany, he proposes to put his plan for a greater Germany in action. And so Germany creates the German Anschluss with Austria. In other words, they annex Austria. Austria becomes a part of Germany, and they do so because Austria has a similar culture, shared language, all of these things. And so Hitler makes the argument that in order to restore the German Empire, this is how we do it. We have to build and add on to our territorial empire, to our territorial acquisitions. Now, here's the thing about Hitler that most people either forget or they don't know in general, and that is the fact that when Hitler begins his conquest of Europe, he does it by asking permission first. And that's what I want you to keep in mind. In September of 1938, the Germans signed the Treaty of Munich with the United Kingdom, with France, and with Italy. And in this treaty, part of the agreement is that Germany can take claim to Czechoslovakia, which was in Eastern Europe. And I want you to keep something in mind here, and this is very important. Czechoslovakia was not at the negotiating table. Nobody asked Czechoslovakia's permission. Nobody asked, hey, does Czechoslovakia want to be a part of this conversation? Nothing. They just negotiated and decided that Czechoslovakia would be conquered at this point. Right? And famously, after this treaty is signed, the British Prime Minister at the time, Neville Chamberlain, declares peace is at hand, right? Peace in our time is what he says. Peace in our time. Now, I do want to add something that's going to be important here as well. Britain has a First Lord of the Admiralty. The First Lord of the Admiralty is essentially their equivalent of our Secretary of the Navy. And his name is Winston Churchill. Churchill has a bit of a reputation. There aren't a lot of people who like him. He seems a bit brash, obnoxious. He's made a lot of mistakes in his career. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt, when he first met him in 1918, Roosevelt said that Churchill and I quote this, Churchill acted like a stinker. So there's that. Churchill's not a popular guy, but Churchill from the very beginning says you cannot negotiate with a guy like Hitler. There's something about Hitler that you cannot trust. He's a con artist, and this guy is playing you, and he's going to use this as a step stool into conquering all of Europe. And if you don't act now in aggression to stop him, he is going to do terrible things to the remainder of Europe, and that's going to lead to another European war. And of course, Churchill was ignored. He was dismissed because people thought, well, Churchill is just being Churchill. So a few months later, Czechoslovakia is invaded and conquered. And in an effort to avoid conflict, Germany then approaches Russia. Russia is led by a guy named Joseph Stalin at this point. Stalin wants to maintain his authority. He would love to add some countries to his territorial power, of course. So they come to this agreement, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in which they basically say, you stay out of our way, we'll stay out of your way. That's the agreement, right? And they promise each other that they won't invade each other's countries. They promise each other that they won't stand in each other's way. And that's really important to Stalin in particular, because Stalin doesn't want anybody invading Russia. He wants to be able to continue killing all the people that he's been killing. Side note, Joseph Stalin is a crazy nut job who's killed about 5 to 6 million people in his own nation. So he's a little bit of a lunatic. And by a little bit, I mean a total crazy nut job. And he wants to continue doing that. And Hitler doesn't want Stalin getting involved either, because if the Russians get involved now and stop the Nazis, then this whole plan goes haywire, right? So this agreement is essentially necessary for them to be able to do what they got to do, which means, or which leads to an invasion and conquering of Poland, again, in Eastern Europe, right on the border of Russia. Russia's okay with this. Russia sees this as, knows that this is going to happen. The people who don't realize this is happening, though, is Great Britain and France, because the UK and France immediately say, wait, why are you conquering other countries? Why wasn't Czechoslovakia enough? You've added Austria, you've added Czechoslovakia. Why do you need more? And why didn't you ask us first? This is particularly important because Poland had said, the people of Poland had said, this guy is coming after us. We think that he's going to invade and try to conquer us. And Great Britain sent reassurances saying, listen, if you're in trouble, we're going to send you support. Don't worry about it, but you're okay. You're protected, and they're not coming after you. You're just imagining things. And lo and behold, they are then conquered by the Nazis. And they are done so in a really quick manner, right? They employ this tactic, this military tactic known as blitzkrieg, which literally means lightning war. And for those of you who are familiar or are fans of football, you should know the word or the term blitz, right? It means, it's a defensive term. It means overwhelming force, where you overwhelm the offense before the offense can really sort of put together a plan that protects their quarterback and make sure that they can't get their play off. So when we talk about blitzkrieg, it's essentially the same idea, where you overwhelm the nation that you are attacking to the point where they can't assemble any kind of strategy in which they can protect themselves, in which that they can fight back, right? So what starts to happen is these Eastern European countries are often overwhelmed and conquered within a couple of days, literally within 2 or 3 days, and that's it. It's usually never more than a week. It happens very quickly. And as a result, the UK and France, just 2 days later, declare war on Germany, because immediately they say, ring the alarm. This guy's out of control. And somewhere Winston Churchill says, I told you so. I told you this guy was a nut job. That's kind of important here, because when we talk about what's unfolding in Europe, particularly in 1939, there's one guy in the United States who's paying attention, and that's Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt is paying careful attention. Plus, there have been communications between him and, say, for example, the King and Queen of England. They have been reaching out to him, and those communications between him and British leadership will increase. So he is getting special communiques. He's getting special updates on what is happening. And so he knows that things are unfolding rather quickly. There also have been reports, and I think what caused him alarm was the fact that early on in Hitler's reign, and we'll talk about this more later, early on in Hitler's ruling as chancellor, he was doing things like destroying books, destroying music, anything affiliated with Jewish artists. He was exercising extremist control over his populations, and he was exercising this sort of authoritarian control. And that's when Roosevelt realizes this is a guy that we've got to watch out for. And so in September of 1939, Franklin Roosevelt is going to introduce something called the cash and carry policy. You don't have to write that down now. I just want you to be aware of where that fits in this timeline, because we're going to talk about that in more detail later on. Just know that this is where it happens. After Great Britain and France, after the United Kingdom and France declare war, literally 2.5 weeks later, Franklin Roosevelt says, this is what we've got to do to respond, okay? Now, once that's put into play, from September 1939 to May of 1940, so essentially for 8 months, Senator William Borah of Idaho, who is an isolationist, says that Europe is engaged in what he calls a phony war. Now, the spelling of phony, this is the British spelling of phony. We spell it P-H-O-N-Y. They spell it with an E because they're British. God bless. But anyway, he says it's a phony war because there's nothing happening on the Western Front, right? All of Eastern Europe has been conquered, and they've been conquered really quickly. So there's not a whole lot of fighting happening on the Eastern Front. And the Nazis haven't made any kind of real move towards the Western Front over these 8 months. So what's the big deal? Nothing's actually happening. Why are we sending them? Why are we giving them stuff? There's nothing happening. Okay, so the British and the French are whining and freaking out for no reason. But Franklin Roosevelt knows differently, because in the early months of 1940, he sends a message to Churchill, right? Churchill, again, at this time is Lord of the Admiralty. And he knows that Churchill is going to be a guy that he can relate to. Not Chamberlain, not the British Prime Minister, Churchill. So in the message to Churchill, he says, hey, if you want to talk about anything, you can reach me directly. This is how you and I can communicate. And it's the beginning of a communication that will last until 1945. Once the war really sort of hits its rhythm, these two men will exchange over 2,000 telegram messages. They will talk on the phone. They will meet in person, and all of their meetings are really sort of incredibly important. They are strategic, they are diplomatic, and they form a very important friendship. But it all begins in the early months of 1940 when Franklin Roosevelt reaches out to him and says, hey, he doesn't say anything pertinent about the war. He just says, hey, if you want to talk about things, talk about, anything in life, reach out to me and I'll be a listening ear. That's pivotal. So in May of 1940, Denmark and Norway are invaded. And this is the beginning of the Nazis making their turn towards Western Europe, right? Denmark and Norway are part of the Scandinavian countries. And these two countries are pivotal because as the Nazis are making their turn towards Western Europe, it is clear they're just making a swing down from the northern part of Western Europe all the way down into Western Europe itself, the mainland of Western Europe. And they're using blitzkrieg, right? And so the British try to put together some semblance of a defense for Norway, but by then it's too late. Norway's been conquered. Denmark falls in one day. Literally one day, Denmark is under Nazi control. And it takes a month for France to fall. 1 month, France is gone. And once France is under Nazi control, that's the entirety of mainland Europe. The entirety of mainland Europe is under Nazi control. And the reason why I say that, and I can say that with such authority, is because Spain is under the control of a dictator named General Francisco Franco, who is essentially, he has total control over Spain, but he has made a deal with Adolf Hitler that he can remain in control of Spain as long as, if Hitler needs anything from him, he'll do Hitler's bidding. So he is essentially a puppet for Hitler. And Italy, you have Benito Mussolini, and Mussolini is a fascist leader in Italy and will eventually join the fight. And Italy has its own goals for empire, not in Europe, obviously, but in northern parts of Africa and into the Middle East. And so he and Hitler will join forces, right? So when France falls and the mainland of Europe is gone, immediately Germany sets its eyes on the one nation that stands in its way of complete authority in Europe, and that's Great Britain. Great Britain, you guys, is a teeny tiny island. Okay, you can drive all around Great Britain within a couple of days. It's not like anywhere here. It is tiny, and not to mention there is also Ireland and Scotland, but those are islands too. So when you talk about these three places, this is what stands between Nazi Germany and democracy, right? Nazi Germany and complete control of all of Europe. And if this battle, the Battle of Britain, goes a different way, then we are talking about an entirely different narrative. This is an entirely different story. You need Britain to win this battle. It is a relentless, terrifying, overwhelming battle for the British, but they pull it out. By October of 1940, they survive. Winston Churchill and his leadership, by September of 1940, he is prime minister, and they all everybody goes underground in London. If you ever go to London, I strongly recommend that you go and take a tour of Churchill's bunker, and you'll see how massive and complicated it is, but it's necessary, especially during this time. By September of 1940, the Tripartite Pact is signed. This is the alliance that is set up between Germany, Italy, and Japan. Japan has been making moves to be the empire in Asia. So they've been making moves to conquer China, but they've also been making moves to conquer most of Southeast Asia. And they also want to take control of the entirety of the Pacific. So every island, every group of islands in the Pacific, they want under their control. So with all this going on, the question is, what are the Americans doing? How are the Americans feeling? How are the Americans responding? Well, in the 1920s lecture, I told you that the trauma of World War I has motivated the Americans to fully embrace isolationism. They want nothing to do with nobody. Right? We don't want any part of any war. We're going to mind our business. We're going to sit on our chair in our corner. Don't talk to us. Why did you invite us to this party? We want no part of it. That's essentially where we're at. Something that really sort of pushes this, especially during the early years of the war, is going to be something called the America First Committee. And the America First Committee is the largest isolationist organization that is formed in the 1930s. You're going to have names that join this committee like Charles Lindbergh, the world's most famous pilot. And we talked about Charles Coughlin. Charles Coughlin is a part of the American First Committee. I think, there are several people, famous names who affiliate themselves with the America First Committee. And essentially their argument is we want nothing to do with a European war. We're not going to send our sons to fight in this war. We don't want to send any money. We don't want to invest in it. We don't want to do anything. This is further sort of emphasized with the neutrality acts that are passed by Congress from 1935 to 1937. These are three separate acts passed by Congress that say the following. And I'm going to try to say this slowly, but if you miss it, pause and come back to this. So the neutrality acts say that Americans cannot do the three following things. Okay? Americans cannot sail on the ships of belligerents, and I have the spelling right here, Belligerents. Americans cannot sail on the ships of belligerents. Americans cannot ship arms to belligerents. And Americans cannot make loans to belligerents. Don't sail on their ships. Don't send them weapons. Don't send them weapons, and don't loan them money. Don't sail on their ships, don't send them weapons, don't lend them any money. So these three things point to the things that ended up leading us into World War I, right? There were American passengers on the Lusitania. The Lusitania was loaded down with weaponry, but also we were sending weapons on the merchant ships. And also we had lent millions upon millions of dollars to the British and the French, which they did not pay back. So we're not going to do it again, right? But here's the problem with these three acts, right? So it defines belligerents as any nation engaged in war. Any nation engaged in war. So in this particular narrative, in this particular story, Poland and Germany would be identified as being at war with each other. So would Denmark and Germany. So would France and Germany. Britain and Germany. Norway and Germany, right? Nowhere in there, and this is the problem with the neutrality acts, nowhere in there do they distinguish between the good guy and the bad guy, the aggressor and the victim, right? They're not talking about the fact that Germany invaded Poland and Poland didn't ask to be invaded. Denmark didn't ask to be invaded, neither did Norway, neither did any of those other countries. Britain didn't ask to engage in battle. These countries signed a peace treaty with this guy. They signed a peace treaty just a year ago, and now we're engaged in war. So this idea that everybody is engaged in war voluntarily is not true, and it's not fair to them, right? So the question becomes, if you are Franklin Roosevelt and you are aware of what's going on in the world, how do you convince an entire nation of people that they need to care, that they need to get involved, that they need to be invested? Well, let's start from the very beginning, okay? So back in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt had already been planting the seeds, but not because he knew this was coming. He just understood that, listen, there's no way Americans in the 1930s can be isolationists. It just doesn't make any sense. Especially when we had already made moves to be an empire, right? When we've already fought wars to be an empire. We had conquered areas, so we now have territories like Guam. We have the Philippine Islands. We have Hawaii. We have Puerto Rico. We've got all of these places. And he says, listen, it's not realistic to be isolationist. So he says, we need to think about being a good neighbor. And he's just focused on the Western Hemisphere. He says, listen, our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere are in similar economic conditions just like we are. And he's just talking about economics. He's not talking about military. He's not saying, hey, if Mexico goes to war with, Canada, we need to help one of the two countries. He's not doing that. He's just talking about economically. And he says, if they're struggling and we have the means to help, we should help. Because that's what good neighbors do. We help in times of need, and we are there to support each other. So in the image below, you see the two women shaking each other's hands. The woman on the right represents the United States. The woman on the left represents Mexico. And the idea that we would set up a partnership, an economic partnership. This is going to be very important because he is going to build on this idea that we have a responsibility, okay? That the Americans have a responsibility to be of support to other countries. That's going to come into play a little later on. Now, earlier I mentioned that Roosevelt introduces something called the cash and carry policy. So let me explain what's going on here. So in September of 1939, he introduces, or late 1939, I should say. Yeah, September of 1939, he introduces something called the cash and carry policy. And he says, look, Great Britain and France are at war now. They've declared war, but they're going to need help. The problem is, though, is that he is limited by the Neutrality Acts. So what he does is he finds loopholes. And here are the loopholes. He says, if Great Britain and France can pay cash for military supplies, if they pay cash for military supplies, and they themselves can carry those military supplies out, they can ship them out on their own ships or whatever, then the Neutrality Acts stand, right? They're still valid. We're not, we're not defying them. We're not breaking them. And we get the benefit of American cash, right? So in other words, we're not lending them money because they're paying cash up front for it. We know that they have the money. And two, we're not shipping arms to them. They have to be able to bring their ships over here. They load the ships they load the weapons onto their ships, and they take them back to their countries. We've got nothing to do with it. So you pay for it, you pick it up, you take it back to your house. Okay? Think of it as ordering from Amazon. You bought it from Amazon, but you decided that you were going to go to the warehouse and pick it up yourself instead of the Amazon delivery driver bringing it to your house. That's what we're talking about here. That's cash and carry, okay? Now, the larger agreement is this. By September of 1940, that is going to expand in that not only are they giving us cash, but Great Britain says, hey, we'd actually be willing to give you land rights to British territories in the Western Hemisphere. Remember, the British, as an empire, have territories everywhere. And they tell us, listen, if we don't have cash up front, what we could do is give you land rights. And what you do with these land rights are entirely your business. And Roosevelt thinks, well, we could actually use those land rights to build military bases, which is exactly what we do. So in September of 1940, by executive order, he sends 50 U.S. Navy destroyers to Great Britain, and Great Britain then gives us land rights for different territories in the Western Hemisphere. He does this again by executive order. And as a result, there are people, especially isolationists in Congress and American First people, who are screaming and demanding for his impeachment. Is it a majority of people? No. But they are furious with him because they think he is pushing us towards greater involvement. He is pushing us towards intervention. And here's why this is going to be significant, right? This question of involvement is especially timely because 1940 is a presidential election year, okay? And nobody has been talking about it, but it's the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is whether or not Roosevelt is going to run for a third term. He doesn't outright dismiss it. I mean, every once in a while he'll say, no, of course not. But it's very sort of like there's tongue-in-cheek sort of response. His mother has a more forceful response than he does. Until we get to the summer of 1940, when it's time for the Democratic National Convention and it's time to nominate someone to be their candidate. At that time, you don't have the primary process the way that we have now. So the nominations really happen on the floor of the National Convention, which makes the National Convention way more exciting and worth watching. What ends up happening, it's a lot of drama, a lot of there's a lot of things happening at the Democratic National Convention in 1940. And if you're interested in knowing, you can take my early 20th century class. But it's really good. It's a lot of drama. But what ends up happening is he is sort of magically drafted to become the nominee for the presidency. And because he's drafted with great cheers and tremendous support, he says, of course, I have to accept the nomination of my party. And then as he campaigns, he says, now is not the time to switch leadership. Look at Europe. Europe is falling apart. You've got to have somebody who has been here for a while. And the American people actually support that. Here's the thing, though. Roosevelt is facing a guy who actually could be a potential threat. This is a guy named Wendell Willkie from New York. He's younger, healthier, more charismatic. He travels way more. Roosevelt is clearly not only feeling his age, he is feeling the long-term effects of polio on his body. So he's not necessarily showing up a lot more in public. He's not campaigning as much. We have seen the effects of 2 terms on presidents. We've seen the effects of 1 term on presidents. The job ages you. It does something to your body because of the stress and the pressure. It does something to you. And take that and do all of that to an already sick man, and it's devastating, right? So Roosevelt is like, okay, if there's going to be a guy that beats me, it's going to be that guy. So when Roosevelt, on top of all that, Roosevelt can't really talk about the war because there are people who just don't want to get involved in the war. So he avoids answering questions about the war and whether or not he's going to send Americans to the war. And in fact, there are a couple of moments where he says, no, we are not sending any Americans into the war effort. We are not going to fight. That sort of thing, even though he knows that eventually that's what's going to happen, right? Inevitably, that's how it will unfold, right? So he knows that can't last, but he doesn't know how to really comment on it until Wendell Willkie says, yeah, the British need our support. We've got to get involved. At the very least, we got to send them more money and more supplies. And that's to Roosevelt's advantage. What ends up happening is Roosevelt not only wins the 3rd term, he wins by a huge margin. The Electoral College results are 449 to 82. I mean, he knows very early on in the evening that he's won this election. That's what I want you to remember, is that, yeah, people are nervous that this guy has run for a 3rd election because nobody's ever done it before. And at that time, there's nothing in the Constitution that says he can't run for a third term. It's just that nobody's ever done it before. They've all followed Washington's example, right? George Washington just left after 2 terms, so everybody else just followed his example. FDR doesn't do that. FDR says, well, there's nothing in the books that say I can't, so why not? Now, mind you, there is in the Constitution, it does say you cannot. It's an actual amendment that says you are limited to 2 terms, and that's it. And the reason why is because of Franklin Roosevelt. They don't want another Franklin Roosevelt. So that's something that you should keep in mind. But when we think about how massive his victory is, it shows you how popular he still is to win the 3rd election. Now, let's talk about how pivotal this time period is. In December of 1940, he gives a speech in which he introduces the Lend-Lease Act. Keep in mind, he's been talking to Winston Churchill, and he's also met with the King of England. The King and his wife, the King and Queen, have actually visited the United States and asked for help. So Roosevelt introduces Lend-Lease, and Lend-Lease essentially says this, that the president could send defense materials to any country that he deemed necessary for American national security. The president could send defense materials to any country whose protection was necessary for the national security of the United States. So let me set this up a little bit better for you. Congress sets aside a budget for defense, okay? And so he's saying, in that budget, you'll set aside however millions of dollars for Lend-Lease, and the president will decide where that money goes. He doesn't have to ask anyone for permission. He doesn't have to get a rubber stamp from Congress or any committee. He gets to decide how much Great Britain gets, how much somebody else gets. And Lend-Lease initially is for Great Britain, but it will expand to other countries later on. So it's a huge help. It's a huge help for Great Britain. But as Lend-Lease expands, other countries are going to benefit as well. So you'll notice the bottom right is a graphic of all the nations that benefit from the Lend-Lease Act. United Kingdom benefits the most with $5.2 billion, but the Soviet Union will also benefit with $2.9 billion. Africa, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean area, China, Australia, New Zealand, and India will also get funding, will also get materials. But here's what I want you to know. The Lend-Lease Act helps put people to work. The American people go to work on the Lend-Lease Act because now there's a demand for stuff. Now there's a demand for materials, whether we're talking about weapons or ships or, uniforms or whatever. Now there's a huge demand. There's a huge market. We have to meet it. And so Americans are put to work immediately. And that is what ends the American Depression. Americans get to work. There is a significant change to that. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. I want to talk about the final thing that really leads into American involvement in the war, and that is the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. So I told you a little bit earlier that Japan had goals of creating an all-Asian Pacific empire. So included in that empire would be the Philippine Islands and the Hawaiian Islands, both of which were territories belonging to the United States. Now, here's the thing. Germany, specifically Hitler, reaches out to the Japanese emperor and says to the emperor, you have to wait on your attack against the United States because it's too soon. Here's the thing. Hitler knows that the Americans are going to get involved in the war. It's an inevitability. What he's trying to do is delay it for as long as possible, because what he understands, and he is correct on this, is that the American military is small, it is antiquated. We would have to play a massive catch-up game, and there's no real way to fight back in the way that we would need to fight back if we were fighting both the Japanese and the Germans at the same time, and there was nobody else to really help us, right? So the Japanese come back and say, listen, I get what you're saying, but we can handle them. The Americans are way too behind. And that's true, because the Japanese at this point have the most advanced military in the United States, and most advanced military in the world, not in the United States, obviously. Most advanced military in the world. Their technology is much more advanced. They have a huge military at that, and the United States just doesn't. And that's pretty significant here too. But there is something else that I want to point out to you, just as a digression here, and that is that both Germany, well, not so much Germany, but the Japanese in particular, have really underestimated the Americans. And I want to give you an example of why. Back in May of 1940, as this intervention effort is increasing, Franklin Roosevelt gives a speech to Congress in which he calls on the production of 50,000 military planes. So he says to the American people, basically, I need you to build 50,000 American military planes, which was 10 times the current capacity of what we had. So in 1938, we only had 1,800 planes total. 1,800. Franklin Roosevelt says we need 50,000. Now, to do that, that would require American businesses to transform their factories, right? They would have to change how workforces are working, what they're doing. But here's what I want you to know. They not only met that goal, they exceeded that goal. And that's the key. When given a challenge, and this is what Roosevelt says, when given a challenge, the American people know how to rise and meet that challenge. And so on the morning of December 7th, Pearl Harbor is attacked for one big reason, and that's because Pearl Harbor had two major aircraft carriers that they housed there. But on December 7th, those two aircraft carriers were out at sea. So they missed the aircraft carriers, and instead the USS Oklahoma and the USS Arizona were attacked and sunk. Hundreds and hundreds of men are killed as a result. And what ends up happening is it immediately, of course, leads to the American declaration of war on Japan. Now you have no choice. We're now engaged in war. And because of the American declaration of war, Germany declares war on the United States. But here's what a lot of people don't know. The announcement of the attack on Pearl Harbor did not come from Franklin Roosevelt, because most people think of Franklin Roosevelt's speech to Congress and how he says that December 7th is a day that will live in infamy. That's not the announcement that the American people hear. The announcement of the attack on Pearl Harbor comes from the First Lady of the United States. Let's listen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking to you tonight at a very serious moment in our history. The Cabinet is convening and the leaders in Congress are meeting with the President. The State Department and Army and Navy officials have been with the President all afternoon. In fact, the Japanese ambassador was talking to the President at the very time that Japan's airships were bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines and sinking one of our transports loaded with lumber on its way to Hawaii. By tomorrow morning, the members of Congress will have a full report and be ready for action. In the meantime, we, the people, are already prepared for action. For months now, the knowledge that something of this kind might happen has been hanging over our heads, and yet it seemed impossible to believe, impossible to drop the everyday things of life and feel that there was only one thing which was important: preparation to meet an enemy no matter where he struck. That is all over now, and there is no more uncertainty. We know what we have to face, and we know that we are ready to face it. I should like to say just a word to the women in the country tonight. I have a boy at sea on a destroyer. For all I know, he may be on his way to the Pacific. 2 of my children are in coast cities on the Pacific. Many of you all over this country have boys in the services who will now be called upon to go into action. You have friends and families in what has suddenly become a danger zone. You cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape a clutch of fear at your heart. And yet I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears. We must go about our daily business more determined than ever to do the ordinary things as well as we can. And when we find a way to do anything more in our communities to help others, to build morale, to give a feeling of security, we must do it. Whatever is asked of us, I am sure we can accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America. To the young people of the nation, I must speak a word tonight. You are going to have a great opportunity. There will be high moments in which your strength and your ability will be tested. I have faith in you. I feel as though I was standing upon a rock. That rock is my faith in my fellow citizens. Now we will go back to the program which we had arranged for tonight.
So Eleanor Roosevelt had a weekly radio show, and after the attack took place, the Roosevelt administration had asked her to make this announcement on her weekly program. And what's interesting here, and I encourage you to go back and listen, but what's interesting here is you can tell in her message that she wants them to understand and wants the American people to understand the gravity of the situation, right? She says that the administration, the president and others had been meeting with the Japanese ambassador, and they were doing it under positive conditions, and here's what's going on. And in the meantime, there's an attack that's taking place. So, in other words, our trust had been basically betrayed, right? Openly betrayed. And even though we knew something might happen, we knew an attack might take place, we did not think it would be like this. So we are stunned, we feel betrayed, we are angry, right? And then she talks to the mothers and wants to relate to how mothers are feeling. And she talks to young people. And in both of those, really the entirety of the message, she is trying to give a message of hope, right? That even when you are anxious and fearful, and she says that's totally normal, right? I know that you have anxiety and that you have fear, but try to live normally. Try to do what you would normally do, because there's hope in that. Try to encourage each other. There is hope in that, right? She talks to young people and says, I have faith in you. I know that you are going to be called to do great things, and I know that you can do it. Imagine you know that your country is on the brink of war, and your responsibility is to find a way to keep the country's spirits positive and hopeful. And it's within 3 minutes, she is able to do, oh, no, I don't want that, to do just that, right? So on that note, in January of 1941, in his State of the Union address, Franklin Roosevelt presents a new approach, a slightly new approach to foreign policy. It's an expansion of what he's been talking about with being a good neighbor and that sort of thing. But he understands, I think, that it's not enough that young men are fighting because the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, that there's going to be a much bigger cause that we have to keep fighting for. Otherwise, nobody's going to want to keep fighting, right? If we're just fighting for revenge, that's not something to keep people motivated. So he argues for something called the Four Freedoms, that Americans are fighting for humanity's access to the four freedoms. So I want to explain something really quick just so you understand how we're going to approach this from now until the rest of this course. Woodrow Wilson sort of creates the foundation for this, right? And he says that America fights for the cause of democracy, that America has a responsibility to protect the cause of democracy, that we are going to intervene on behalf of democratic nations, and we are going to be the light and the example of democracy. Franklin Roosevelt says, okay, that's nice, but here's the thing. Not everybody's going to have democracy. And in those places where they don't have democracy and instead are facing issues of oppression, in those areas where people are dealing with issues of want, of struggle, of pain, those places need help too. It's not just democracies. So in other words, we have to think of people everywhere. He says, everybody on earth is guaranteed four freedoms. Every human being is guaranteed four freedoms. So he is not discriminating against democracies and communists and socialists. He's not talking about industrialized nations versus non-industrialized. He's not talking about white people versus black people versus brown people, old people versus young people. Every human being has access to these four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear, freedom from want, as they are depicted in these four Norman Rockwell images that you see on the right. Every person has the freedom to express themselves. Every person has the right to be able to share their opinion and share their belief. Now, obviously, there are limits in how they do that, right? We don't want to put people in danger, but they should be able to share their opinion. And sharing their opinion means being able to think what they want to think, right? The freedom of thought is tied to the freedom of expression. And a lot of what's happening in Japan and Nazi Germany, and of course Italy, is you're not even allowed to think freely, let alone speak freely. But he says, Franklin Roosevelt says, every person should be able to speak freely. They should also be able to worship as they want, whomever they want to worship. So that freedom to access their God is up to them, without having the fear of being denied that right. Freedom from fear means you should be able to live your life like a regular person without being afraid of what your government will do to you, what the authorities in government will do to you, right? Freedom from fear is freedom from oppression. That you can lay your head at night, sleep okay, wake up okay, live as normally as possible, and be exactly who you are without worrying about the government taking revenge on you, the government targeting you, government authorities or government military arms reaching out and punishing you for whatever reason, right? The last one is freedom from want. And freedom from want basically says that every human being is guaranteed access to the basic needs of humanity. So that's food, water, shelter, the things that we need to survive. We should have access to that without any fear, right? Without any limits. So this idea that there are people out there struggling to just feed themselves, let alone feed their children, is a problem. So here's how this is different from Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson's only looking at the cause, the ideological cause of democracy. And Franklin Roosevelt is looking at the need of humanity, right? He is talking about the idea that we have to think about human beings as a whole, that there is a principle here, and that human beings are being denied these very basic rights. And when those are denied, we have an obligation to step in, to get involved, and to stand up for those people. So now that we are involved, and now that we are fighting, what does the home front look like? Well, a lot like it did during World War I, right? I want to go back to when I talked about Franklin Roosevelt calling on the production of 50,000 planes and that sort of thing. So I told you that he would have to partner with American businesses, and these businesses would have to transform their factories and have their workforces change their purposes to be able to achieve the 50,000 planes thing. So Roosevelt actively recruits business leaders who know how to build complex products very quickly and in large numbers. And so the easiest place to do that, of course, is the auto industry, right? Because the auto industry could build cars very quickly, and it's, of course, a very complex product. But they could build it very quickly using all of these employees. They knew how to, thanks to the assembly line, knew how to put all of these things together very quickly. And Roosevelt says to Congress, hey, if you can create opportunities for these business leaders, that actually helps to move things along. So they create tax incentives. Business leaders are given advance payments like, hey, we're investing in you guys, and you're doing this for the betterment of the economy. If you hire people, you can train new people, get people to work. This would be great. So he actually reaches out to General Motors first, and General Motors actually repurposes their auto industry specifically for the purpose of building planes. So they're no longer building cars, they are now building planes. Now, is this long term? No. They know that it's for the purpose of the war effort in Europe, but that's what they're going to do. So immediately, not only do they have their existing workforce, they have to hire more people. Those people have to be trained, but those people also are now working, which means they're earning money, and that's what's getting money back into the economy. Once the war starts for the Americans, however, right? Once Pearl Harbor is attacked and the Americans declare war, there is a shift in the workforce, because now all of these men, and there are a lot of women too, who now are shipped off to different places to train and then to fight in the war. And so because of that, the question is, okay, who's going to take care of what in these factories that have to still keep producing at this level? One of the things that I want you to know is that our Navy, if we have only 1,800 planes, we have even less ships, and we have literally no shipbuilding industry. So California has to create from scratch its own shipbuilding industry. And they do it from scratch, and they do it as a part of this incentive that Franklin Roosevelt creates. Franklin Roosevelt says, listen, we're going to be a part of, we're going to have to engage in a massive naval war with the Japanese, and we're going to have to do it at a level where our technology not only is updated, but it can rival that of the Japanese. Can you do it? And the Americans don't have any choice but to say yes, right? So this is where the Office of War Information becomes really important. You can see only some, these are not all, some of the posters used during the war campaign to motivate Americans to join in the war effort. You saw one of them at the very beginning of this presentation. It's right there at the top left corner. But a lot of these are designed to help motivate women in particular to either join in the industries, to work at different factories in different places. We'll talk about that more in a minute. Or in conservation efforts, right? To save things like the fats from bacon and sausage, like after you cook the bacon and the sausage, saving all of the oil from after you fry it, setting aside in a jar. And then after you've saved enough to put it aside, send it to a butcher, and the butcher will send all that oil to different factories or different government agencies, and they would use that towards weapon development. The same thing would go for rubber and aluminum foil and that sort of thing. All of that is designed, all of those were, people were using those products towards weapon production and all sorts of things. When we talk about the wartime industry, though, one of the things that I want you to keep in mind here is that there is a huge turnout and a huge change in civilian industries, right? So before I get into this segment of the lecture, there are a lot of industries that change their purpose. I talked about General Motors making planes. There are industries that change their purpose completely. Like, for example, I think it was Revlon or some other makeup company. Rather than making lipsticks, they made bullets, right? So they're repurposing themselves for the war effort. But this would mean that they would have to do what General Motors did, and that means hire more workers, fill in the gaps that had been left behind by the men. The problem, though, is the existing ideas and mindsets that prevented people from actually getting hired for these positions in times of need. Let's start with women. So when we talk about women at work, you'll notice that there are several posters here, a couple in particular, that are designed to motivate women to work. So in that second row, I don't know if this will actually work. You know what, I don't want to take that risk. So in the second row, right here in the middle, is a woman who is dressed in overalls with a do-rag on her hair, and her husband standing behind her with his arms around her. I'm proud. My husband wants me to do my part. And then, of course, the most prolific propaganda figure of World War II, and that's Rosie the Riveter, right? Rosie the Riveter right here in her overalls and do-rag saying famously, "We can do it." There's also another young woman here, "Victory waits on your fingers," because there are secretarial positions that need to be filled. I want to talk about these two positions in particular, Rosie the Riveter and this image right here. So Rosie the Riveter is created, she's based on a real woman, but her name's not Rosie, but that's not the point. So Rosie the Riveter is created specifically to target middle-class white women and upper-class white women, because these are women who did not work outside of the home. These were women who were expected to stay at home, be homemakers, be wives, be mothers, and that's it. That was their responsibility. We can go back to the progressive era when a lot of middle class women were told that this was their job. So now here we are in the early 1940s, and a lot of their husbands have gone off to war. And this is this really weird time where their government is telling them, hey, we need you to go to work. And we're not just wanting you to go to work as cooks or teachers or babysitters. We need you to go to work as welders. We need you to go to work building planes. We need you to go to work in the factories. We need you to build ships. We need you to do things that would typically be described as masculine work. The problem with that is, while women answered the call, they are met with a lot of male bosses who say things like, does your husband know that you are working outside of the home? Does your husband know? Did you get permission from your husband to do this job? Does he know that you're working in this kind of environment? What about your kids? Who's watching your kids? Who's going to raise your kids? Questions that we would now deem completely inappropriate and a violation of all sorts of laws. The thing is they are met with a lot of misogyny, right? And of course, there's a lot of these expectations that these women would be incapable of doing the work. What ends up happening, though, is several million women leave their homes and do the work incredibly well. They do really, really well. The other thing that I want to emphasize here is that Black women, working class women, these women have always been working. So there is no need to campaign to them. As soon as these war industries are created, especially as in early 1940, as soon as they're created, those women are automatically going to those industries. So you don't need to recruit them. They're already looking for jobs. But middle class women, middle class white women and wealthier women, those women have to be recruited. And they are. The other issue that comes up is discriminatory hiring. So when Black workers look for these jobs in the military industry or the defense industry in particular, they are usually relegated to jobs that are behind the scenes, right? That they are usually hired to work on the janitorial staff. They are hired to work in the cafeterias. These are jobs that they are not allowed to work on the line, right? They're not allowed to work in these primary jobs that are paid significantly better. So they are paid much less, and for jobs that they are in many cases overqualified for. And because they are not given equal access to those jobs, at one point, there is a threat from civil rights leaders to organize a march on Washington. Franklin Roosevelt has to talk to his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, who is also a civil rights activist, and say to her, hey, can you talk to your friends and tell them not to organize this march? And Eleanor Roosevelt says to him, well, if you would get your act together, maybe they wouldn't have to do this march. Listen, if you want to know more about Eleanor Roosevelt, just ask me. I will happily tell you some amazing stories about Eleanor Roosevelt. What happens as a result is Franklin Roosevelt signs Executive Order 8802, which bans discriminatory practices in hiring. And essentially what he says is this: listen, we are at war and we don't have time for your foolishness. We need these people to work on the lines. We need planes, we need tanks, we need guns, we need ships. You can't allow your foolishness to stop us from getting what we need. So hire these people immediately. So that's what happens, which is incredibly important. Now, let me also say this. If you're interested, I can give you links to cartoons from Disney and Warner Brothers that are all designed for the wartime effort. It's designed to get people motivated and inspired for the wartime effort. There's one with Donald Duck to pay his taxes. Pay your taxes to defeat the Axis. It's great, but just let me know. Okay, so as soon as we are in this wartime effort, immediately the question becomes, what is it going to look like when men and women come back from the war? So there are men on the front lines of the war, but there are also women who are serving in the Women's Auxiliary Corps and in other different forms of service, in addition to the Red Cross and in other areas. And the question becomes, what is it going to look like when they come back? And this is incredibly important because when you think about leadership, doesn't think, good leadership, I should add, good leadership doesn't think about right now or 6 months from now. Good leadership doesn't even plan for a year from now. Good leadership is thinking about 5 years from now. Good leadership thinks about 10 years from now, right? Franklin Roosevelt, because he had served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson, he knows and has memories of World War I veterans coming back and not getting jobs and not getting the support they needed to transition back into mainstream life. And he also remembers, as so many of you should, about bonus marchers, that they were, promised this measly bonus that they would supposedly get sometime in the 1940s, and that they wanted to get in the Depression, and then they were chased off by the Army. So the question becomes, okay, how are we going to address this? What they start to do is they start thinking about, how do we create a plan that is actually going to help not just these men and women, but also affect the entire country for the long term and not just the immediate. So it can't just be a life insurance premium. It's got to be something much more significant than that, right? And so you have the National Resources Planning Board, which is a government agency affiliated with the federal government. The National Resources Planning Board is given this assignment to think about ways in which these veterans, once they come back from the war, how they can be incorporated back into mainstream life and how the government can support them long term. They come up with a plan that is entitled The Way of Life of Free Men. And the way of life of free men is best described by a quote from Franklin Roosevelt. And Roosevelt basically says this. He says, unless there is security here at home, there cannot be lasting peace in the world. And that security, think back to the New Deal lecture, that security includes economic security. Unless there is economic security, you can't really feel like you have a stable, reliable life, right? So the goal is, what do we create? And so the larger umbrella term is the Economic Bill of Rights. Franklin Roosevelt introduces the Economic Bill of Rights on January 11th, 1944, in his State of the Union address. And in introducing this, he says, this economic bill is a guarantee to every American that they would have a living wage, a decent home, a good education, and adequate medical care. Now, this should sound really familiar to you if you remember the New Deal lecture, because this sounds a lot like what Huey Long proposed in his Share Our Wealth program, right? Every American should have a home, a minimum income, college tuition. That's what he proposed. Roosevelt says a living wage, decent home, good education, and adequate medical care. Medical care is a brand new concept that's being introduced here, okay, from the presidential level. Now, that obviously doesn't take place. However, what does is the GI Bill of Rights. The GI Bill of Rights is also known as the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944. So, this bill is essentially a promise to World War II veterans, okay? And essentially, this is not just about employment opportunities, because it is about employment opportunities, but it's also about housing and educational opportunities. It's about employment, housing, and educational opportunities, specifically for veterans. So the GI Bill of Rights presented employment, housing, and educational opportunities for veterans. This is an investment. The federal government is basically saying, we are investing in you because you served your country. We are investing in you, right? And we are saying to you that we are going to create opportunities for you to find access to work. We are also creating opportunities for access to medical care. That's the VA. We're also creating opportunities for you to seek out housing opportunities, and most importantly, educational opportunities, giving them the financial support to go to college, which is huge because most of these guys who go off to war, most of these men especially, but a lot of the women too, can never imagine themselves going to college. And now here's the federal government saying to them, if you want to, it's entirely your choice, but if you want to, you can go to college on our dime. Okay? This is the one bill that creates a generation of well-educated, well-paid, middle-class Americans. There is no other bill in the history of the United States that will do more to expand the American middle class. No bill in the history of this country does more. It is unprecedented at this time. And that's because the federal government is turning around, facing these veterans, these thousands and thousands of veterans, and saying, for your service, we are investing in you. Now, is it perfect? No. For Black veterans, they are often unable to get bank loans for mortgages, especially when they are limited to Black neighborhoods. So that's despite the fact that they are veterans and despite the fact that they should have the support of the federal government behind things like the FHA and that sort of thing. They don't get that, but what ends up happening, though, there are changes eventually that will come, but it's very slow. But here's the other thing that you should know. By 1955, because it's initially funded from 1945 to 1955, and then it'll be extended. By 1955, 4.3 million home loans are issued over 10 years, and that's at a value of $33 billion. We're going to talk about how that changes the American cultural landscape in the next lecture, or in 2 lectures from now. But I just want you to be aware that this is a massive game changer for the United States. A huge, huge game changer. Okay. I should also say, just as a spoiler alert, I did say 1944. You should know or remember that 1944 is indeed a presidential election year. And yes, Franklin Roosevelt will run for a 4th time. Okay, let's talk about the American dilemma for a second. The American Dilemma is based on a couple of things. We've talked about this before, but it's worth mentioning. There is this idea about patriotic assimilation that keeps coming up, right? That keeps showing up, especially during wartime, right? And this idea that it becomes an intense time of patriotism, where you have to prove your loyalty to the United States and prove that you're a real, true American. And this is especially problematic for minorities, and especially so during this time if you were a Japanese American. So Japanese Americans went through a period of internment, where through a presidential executive order, Executive Order 9066, I don't think I have that on here. Let me check. No. Executive Order 9066 actually orders people of Japanese descent to take what they could carry and leave for internment camps where they could all be housed in an area where they could be watched over by members of the military, out of fear that the Japanese people of Japanese descent could not be trusted, and that they would somehow launch an attack from the inside of the country. This is entirely assigned based on their racial identity and nothing else. Keep in mind, we're at war with Germany, we're at war with the Italians. That's not done to them. 60% of the people taken to these internment camps, 60% of them were American citizens. A vast majority of those people had been born in the United States. A lot of them had never even been to Japan, so loyalty to the Japanese emperor made zero sense. English was their first language. America had always been their home country. They identified themselves as Americans, and yet because they looked how they looked, they were driven out of their businesses, driven out of their workplaces, driven out of their homes, and sent to these internment camps. And once they got to their internment camps, ironically, they were made to sign loyalty oaths in which they pledged that they were always loyal to the United States. Now, even if they signed the loyalty oaths to the United States, they remained in the internment camp. So it's not like signing the loyalty oath made any real difference, right? This is happening primarily to the Japanese American population in California and other parts of the West Coast. So they are sent to internment camps throughout the American West. The one that's farthest east is one in Arkansas. And a lot of young Japanese men, to avoid the internment camp experience, make sure that they are signed up to fight in the war, right? Because this executive order is pretty early on in the war effort, and this is the interesting thing. In Hawaii, there is a massive Japanese population there, and those orders are ignored, and the Japanese population remain free because this is seen as completely discriminatory and a little bit ridiculous. One of the things that I also want to add here is that a lot of the reason why we are able to break Japanese code in the Pacific is because of Japanese soldiers involved in the Navy. Now, one Japanese American citizen named Fred Korematsu sues the United States, sues the federal government, and says that as a citizen, his 14th Amendment rights, specifically equal protection under the law, had been violated by being forced to go to an internment camp, and that he should not be forced to go to an internment camp just because he was Japanese. Now, the Supreme Court will side with the United States and say, well, these are extreme times. The military has their own rules. And so during times of war, there are different laws at stake, and this is what happens. But I want you to think about what the dissenting voice says. So the dissenting voice is Justice Robert Jackson. And Robert Jackson says that he starts off by saying Korematsu was born in the United States and his parents just happened to be Japanese. They were born in Japan, right? And he also talks about the fact that, okay, yes, the military has their way of doing things. However, we are a court. We are a part of the law, the legal system, and we don't answer to the military. Military law does not apply to us. What the Army does not apply to how we interpret the Constitution. Whether we are at war or not, that does not matter here. The law is the law, Jackson says. The law is the law, right? And so when we talk about people who are saying things like, well, it's a military emergency, and so we have to do what we've got to do, Jackson says that's nonsense, because what that's going to do is it's going to set a precedent where, well, it's an issue of national security, so I'm going to have to keep you in jail because I don't know that I can trust you as a free citizen. Jackson says, you can't do that. People are going to use whatever excuse possible to abuse their power. And essentially what's happening here is we are punishing a legal citizen of the United States because he happens to be of Japanese descent. And this is a dangerous precedent that we are setting. We are allowing this sort of abuse of power to continue, despite the fact that we know that our obligation is to the law and not to this military emergency, not to this time of war. The law remains the law, even during times of war, right? It would take years, but when we talk about what ends up happening, the Supreme Court would later on, many years later, essentially say that this decision, the Korematsu decision, to side with the United States and side with the American military was wrong. Now, here's the additional thing that happens during the war effort. So when we talk about the Black American experience during the war, Black Americans who are in the war effort, who are fighting in the war, are in segregated units, right? They are fighting in segregated units. They train in segregated camps. And the irony of that is, over the course of the war, when there are German and Italian prisoners of war, they actually eat side by side with white American soldiers in the mess hall. But Black American soldiers are not allowed to eat with their white American comrades. So the racism is deep and real. So it's a really bizarre experience for them, right? Black soldiers come back with stories of feeling the prejudice even from their fellow countrymen. And here's the thing, in these experiences, what happens as a result is the birth of the modern civil rights movement. Specifically, they'll call it the double V, victory abroad and victory at home. You'll see the poster here to the right. What they're talking about is that they have this realization that they are fighting against oppression, and they are fighting against an oppressive government, an oppressive society in Europe and everywhere else, only to come home and live in an oppressive system. And that didn't make any kind of sense to them. Why are we fighting for the cause of democracy? Why are we fighting for the cause of the four freedoms if we ourselves are not allowed access to the four freedoms? And so they start to put together this campaign to fight for these causes. When I tell you about the Black experience, I want to include the story of Isaac Woodard. You can Google his story if you want, but Isaac Woodard was a World War II veteran who was honorably discharged. He served his time and came home to South Carolina, literally landed still in his uniform, takes the bus to go home to see his wife and his family. He was on the bus. He needed to take a break to go to the restroom. And of course, because he was a Black man, he was not allowed to use any regular restrooms in South Carolina. He begged the bus driver to pull over. The bus driver refused, and now it gets to a point of an emergency, and the bus driver yells at him, pulls over because he sees cops, tells the cops to come and get this guy. The South Carolina police beat Isaac Woodard while he was still wearing his uniform, and they beat him so badly that he was left permanently blind. I should also add that Isaac Woodard was, just before he was discharged, he was awarded the Bronze Star. This is the experience of a lot of Black veterans. And so when we talk about this Double V campaign, it is deeply personal, and it will be incredibly important for what's to come. I want to add to that a book that's written by a social scientist from Europe called An American Dilemma. The American Dilemma is basically commenting on the fact that Americans fight for the cause of democracy and don't actually exercise the purpose of democracy at home. Americans are being called out for this by Europe. I want you to put a pin in that because that's going to come back a little later. So let's talk about how the war comes to an end. And I know that I didn't talk about any battles, but that's because I focus on all sorts of other things. I want to talk about what will be known as the most terrible weapon. So in 1939, Albert Einstein writes a letter to Franklin Roosevelt. Albert Einstein, who was Jewish, lived in Germany, escaped Germany, came to the United States. He writes to Roosevelt and says, Germany's developing a weapon of mass destruction, and Hitler's going to use whatever means necessary to obtain this weapon, and if he gets it, he will use it, and the United States needs to do its part to get one of its own. Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill have their own meeting in 1940, where they also discuss this weapon. And I believe it's 1940 or 1941 where they discuss it, but they also in this meeting discuss the fact that they are intentionally going to leave the Russians out of it. By this time, the Russians are engaged in war with the Germans because the Germans decided that they would invade Russia. The Russians beat them back and are pushing them back through Europe, and Joseph Stalin becomes an ally to the Americans and to the British. And you can see that picture in the bottom right there of these three men sitting together. It's one of a few conferences where they sit and negotiate and talk about how the war should end and what the world would look like after the war is over. Roosevelt and Churchill talk about this massive weapon, and Roosevelt authorizes a secret project called the Manhattan Project, which costs millions of dollars, employs dozens of physicists to put this together. And of course, Robert Oppenheimer as the lead physicist, essentially, after years of research, puts together successfully a test that successfully creates this atomic weapon. After that test, he and other physicists write a letter to then President Truman saying, don't ever use this weapon. We don't know how deadly it is. We don't know how disastrous it will be. Just from the test itself, we know that it's bad. And it's horrible. It's the most terrible weapon. Use it as a threat. Don't use it in real life. So with that, knowing that there's a weapon like that in development, I want to talk about what this planning phase looks like. And I want to talk about the big three in particular. So these big three, before I get into the conferences, these three men are really the odd coupling. FDR and Churchill, that friendship is deep and real. But Joseph Stalin is, one, a communist, and two, super paranoid, very much an authoritarian leader who's killed millions of his own people. But the weird twist in this is that you need Joseph Stalin on your side. You need the Russians to defeat the Germans. You need the Russians to push the Germans out of Russia and out of Eastern Europe. And interestingly enough, you need Joseph Stalin at this negotiating table. And the reason why is because if you don't include him in these talks, then who knows what the Russians are going to do. That's the mindset here. So these three men are all, Stalin is suspicious of Churchill and Roosevelt. Churchill and Roosevelt are suspicious of Stalin. But on the outside, they're super friendly with each other, okay? They meet several times. They'll meet in, their last meeting, however, will be in Yalta. The Yalta Conference takes place in February of 1945. And I want you to take a look at what Franklin Roosevelt is looking like in that point. Franklin Roosevelt is dying. In the last year of his life, particularly in the last few months, he has been diagnosed with a terrible heart condition. He has extremely high blood pressure. Like at some point, he reaches numbers like 200 over 100, like in those ranges. And that's on top of all of his other health issues. He's lost a tremendous amount of weight. His face looks sunken in there, as you can see. He's not feeling well. And most people know, and it's pretty clear that he is not going to live out the entirety of this term. So him knowing that means that he is doing whatever he can to make some kind of deal with Joseph Stalin where communism is not spreading through Eastern Europe the way that it is, and we'll talk about that more in the next lecture. And he is trying to set up a post-war world in which he can try to guarantee or pave the way for more democracies. It doesn't necessarily work out in that way in all aspects. Communism does spread into Eastern Europe, but Roosevelt does significantly well, right? 2 months later, in April of 1945, Franklin Roosevelt dies. He has an aneurysm, and he dies at his retreat in In Arkansas, he had created a polio retreat for polio patients from across the country to come and find treatment and get help and support. And then he would come and spend time with them and get his own treatment as well. That's where he died. And Franklin Roosevelt, in coming there, tried to get some level of relief and really didn't. It wasn't really possible, to be fair, when we talk about what his experiences are in this moment, or what happens in the immediacy of this moment. Well, it's really quite dramatic. So we'll talk about that more in a moment. A couple of weeks later, the fascist leader of Italy, Benito Mussolini, is arrested and brought back to Italy. He's actually trying to escape Italy because he knows he's in trouble. So he is arrested with his much younger mistress and brought back to Italy, where he is executed, and people take turns defiling his dead body. Let's not talk about that. Now, in what is quite possibly the worst honeymoon ever, Adolf Hitler marries Eva Braun, and then he kills himself. He kills Eva Braun, or she kills herself, but he kills himself for sure, because the inevitable is right around the corner, right? They know that Germany is about to crumble, and rather than see it for himself, and rather than give orders to his own people, this is what he manages to do. He finds his own escape route, right? Interestingly enough, he rejoices at the death of Roosevelt a couple of weeks earlier, only for him to die at his own hand. This is what I want you to keep in mind about these two men. They both rose to power at the same time, and their lives end and their time in power ends at the same time. But look at the impact that both of these men had. In his memorial to Franklin Roosevelt, Churchill says that we have just lost the greatest friend to democracy. And you have an entire nation of people who don't know what the country is like under a different president, because there's an entire generation of Americans who were born when Roosevelt became president, and now have to know and learn what life is like without him. So let's talk about the new guy in charge for a minute. The new guy is Harry S. Truman, who was a senator from Missouri from 1935 to 1945, and he's really good at being a senator. He's really good at it. That's all he wants to be, quite frankly. An effective leader. He's the chairman of the Committee on Military Affairs. It's also nicknamed the Truman Committee. He's that good. He knows how to keep people accountable. He knows how to be efficient. And then in 1944, because he's so good, because he has pretty wide appeal, because he's seen as a straightforward, widely appealing, not too liberal Democrat, he is asked to serve as vice president to Franklin Roosevelt in the 1944 election, and he cries. He closes the door and privately cries. Because he doesn't want to be president of the United States. And this is the thing. Everybody who's been paying attention to Franklin Roosevelt knows that this man is dying. And they know that it's a matter of time before the vice president becomes president of the United States. The picture that you see below is the one and only meeting that these two men had when they were candidates for the election. It's just for the purpose of a photo op. It's the one and only meeting they have. And the experience is eye-opening for Truman because they're just having tea together. They were having lunch together. So Roosevelt is pouring tea for himself, and his hand was shaking so badly that Truman reached over and did everything for him because Roosevelt couldn't do it. He didn't have the strength for it. And that's when Truman knew for sure that that he was in trouble, that it would only be a matter of days, right? And here's the other thing that you should know, and this is the real shocker of it all. Knowing that this man is going to die, nobody is preparing Harry Truman for what's to come. Nobody's having conversations with Harry Truman about, hey, Harry, this is what Roosevelt is thinking for the end of the war. This is what Roosevelt is planning. This is his strategy for what's to come. This is how his negotiations have been going with Churchill and Stalin. Nobody has been having these conversations with him. So for the first time in American history, the presidential inauguration takes place on January 20th. And so he becomes vice president of the United States on January 20th. And that lasts until April 12th of 1945. He oversees a session of the Senate, and as he's walking back to his office, he is called and told, you need to come to the White House immediately. And Eleanor Roosevelt asks him to come and meet with her, and she's the one who tells him that the president is dead. And so Harry Truman does the thing that we would all do in those moments. And he says to her, Mrs. Roosevelt, I'm so sorry for your loss. Is there anything that I can do for you? She turns to him and she says, no. Is there anything we can do for you? For you're the one in trouble now. And Harry Truman would later write that he said it was in that moment that he realized that the moon and stars had just fell on his head. And we'll talk about what that looked like for him in our next lecture.